Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today we're going to talk about gambling. We wanted to tackle this topic because it does have an archetypal foundation. Games of chance are probably as old as human civilization, and the notion of a deity of luck against whom we might try ourselves and take a chance is embedded in many mythologies. But gambling is becoming more of an issue in our current culture in the United States. There's been an explosion of internet-based and smartphone app-based sports gambling that seems actually targeted, particularly at young men. Gambling can be a serious addiction that can have real consequences. And so we're going to talk about a range of things connected to gambling. We're going to try to keep it psychological. I found myself getting increasingly angry as I read about these recent practices that seem rather predatory to me, but I'll try to keep it in a psychological frame.
Well, before we begin, I would just like to thank everyone who is contributing to our Patreon efforts to fundraise and fund This Jungian Life. We couldn't be doing it without you. One of our missions at This Jungian Life is to suspend any kind of corporate sponsorship, which would have a negative influence, we feel, on our content. So in order to keep our efforts free and committed to what we think is a depth psychological approach, we need your help. So please, if you're a fan of the podcast, just go to thisjungianlife.com and click the link at the top that will direct you to our Patreon page and consider becoming a patron. We do some additional short podcasts for patrons at different levels that we hope you'll enjoy, and we would really appreciate your support.
Also gambling.
Gambling. You know, one of the things that strikes me about gambling is just how ancient it is. It seems like games of chance have been around since human beings had the free time to play. Dice, for instance, is really an ancient game. And that impulse that we have to want to intensify the game by raising the stakes, and then all of a sudden betting comes into the game so that there's much more intensity that's being played out. And there is something really compelling about raising the stakes, right? You have a stake in the game, and then all of a sudden you're really paying attention.
You know, as kids, we used to play a game of rummy, and everyone had his or her own jar of pennies. If you had a really good night, I guess you could earn over $1. But it did, just as you were saying, Joseph, it raised the stakes. And people play golf for, very tiny amounts of money. My husband's a golfer. He comes home and I won $11 or something. It's really just a pittance. But your point about the psychology of raising the stakes is really well taken, that we want to win something concrete.
I'm thinking about gambling as a metaphor for life. And this popped up for me, Joseph, when you talked about like raising the stakes. Like when you think about, we're all sort of living this game of chance that is life. And if we roll the dice, and we roll the dice all the time, what are we going to get? I mean, I was talking with someone who is considering trying to conceive, and she was mentioning that it's a big roll of the dice, Are you going to get a healthy child? Are you going to find out you can't have children? Are you going to perhaps have a child that has a problem that could change the course of your life? So that is a roll of the dice. When you get married, that's a roll of the dice. You think that it's, you've maybe picked a good partner, but you don't really know. Is the person going to get sick in 5 years? Is the person going to be an inveterate cheater? There's some things you just can't tell. You just don't know. Our health is always a roll of the dice, and we take risks. We maybe drive when we've had just maybe one too many glasses of wine and we feel like it's a risk worth taking. So there is that element in life. And we have to have an appetite to a certain extent for risk to really live. If we try to shield ourselves from all risk, then we would just stay under the covers in bed all day. There's something about the appetite for risk that is in service to life, I think. And I think that this is why this notion of Fortuna as the goddess, the Roman goddess of luck was Fortuna. And, that's a powerful archetypal image.
Yeah. I think what you said is so well taken. And that when we have faith in ourselves and faith in the gods and faith in our fortune, we say, sure, I will take the risk. Let's get married. Let's start a family. And when we are feeling confident, it also increases our appetite for something like gambling, that we're willing to take that risk too. People are in a good mood, that somehow the gods are with me. I'm on a roll. I feel like those archetypal powers and I are aligned.
Well, I think that's definitely the hope, that the gods are going to shine on us. We were joking, luck be a lady tonight, and this it's a
totally
prayer
stuck in my head right
exactly, now. To this mysterious Lady Fortuna,
yes,
to kind of blow on the dice, which is another interesting thing. You blow on the dice to give them a kind of autonomous soul that's going to kind of give you what you want at the end.
And yet cheating has also been a big part of that. We all know about loaded dice. You increase the odds. There's been a cynical, even predatory aspect to gambling, probably for as long as gambling has been around.
To tip the odds in the favor of the house, if you're at a big casino, or tip the odds in the favor of you if you've put some lead in your dice so you can predict how the roll is going to go. But coming back to the just the kind of archetypal forces, I was thinking about when we become gamblers, we take on a kind of configuration. And I'm thinking that because the few times that I've gambled, and by the way, buying a bit of cryptocurrency, which went from like $3,000 to 0.0006 cents, was like a total gambling experience that I had just this year. And I could feel like the craziness moving around in my head. And on one level, there is this incredible, exciting, hopeful impulse to want to transcend the kind of confines of one's material life. We're going to buy Bitcoin when it's, $1, and then we're all going to become Bitcoin millionaires. So this venturing into this unknown place, and at the same time holding this tension between trying to control what's happening, or the fantasy of control, and then a surrender to fate, the Moirai, and hoping that there's a secret fate that's not logical but is going to emerge as we cast ourselves into this thrilling, unfamiliar place.
So a couple things that I just heard in there, Joseph, is first of all, inflation.
Yeah.
I think when we make a big bet, there is a sense of inflation. Like we make the bet thinking we're going to win,
Yeah.
And then there's also magical thinking.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely, there was magical thinking.
But that is all built in. That is all built right in to engaging in games of chance, that we believe in our own bet. We can blow on the dice. Other people are doing it. So there's a kind of social normalizing that everybody is doing, going to the casino. Look at all the other people here. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And all of that tendency that we have to believe that somehow we can influence the fates.
Or that Lady Luck is on our side.
Yes, we'll be the blessed ones. Right.
Exactly. All of those things conspire to catapult us into beliefs and feelings that are absolutely not reality-based. And the old mantra, I think everybody has heard it, is the house always wins. And if it didn't, there wouldn't be any casinos or anything else. So we managed to just push that right into the background in the excitement of the risk-taking that is so normalized that this is my night. This is my time. I can do my own rags to riches story.
One of the things I came across as I was doing some reading for this episode is there are centers where people, academic centers at universities where people study gambling and the psychology of gambling. And one of these researchers pointed out that gambling used to be considered a sin or a vice. And now it's sort of being, normalized and sort of presented as wholesome. We're just a bunch of guys, getting together around this game, and it's just, be part of the game or whatever. So I think the researchers are really concerned that it's a problem. I wanted to say just one other thing, which I think is just so fascinating, is if there's any doubt that there isn't a kind of archetypal echo, the fact that our modern day conception of chance is pictured as Lady Luck is a direct link back to the goddess Fortuna and the Greek goddess, her counterpart Tyche. So somehow archetypally we have, think of this as a kind of female characteristic. I believe there's a Hindu goddess who's also associated with chance. And the other thing I found out is that Loki, the Norse god, is associated with bad luck.
I'm veering into your use of the word game, gambling, gaming, all of that kind of thing. But I'm thinking that today, in today's culture, maybe it has taken on a much more cynical or darker kind of connotation, that the game is rigged. There is something about all of the games of chance, including cryptocurrency, Joseph, and for lots of other people out there, of that there is malintent to take advantage, to fleece people, that it's all just a big rigged game and we try to play and win, and a kind of get it while you can, take your risk, that there isn't an undercurrent simply of the goddess, Lady Luck or Fortuna. It's rigged, but maybe you can win.
I used to read a lot of Russian literature, and in Tolstoy's novels, there were often scenes where a young man gets ruined by gambling, which was so interesting to me as a young person reading it because it just seemed kind of foreign. I think it was always cards, if I recall, and the reason it wound up in his novels is because that happened to him. He just lost an inordinate amount of money, and I think had to kind of be dug out by his parents or something, but probably got the details wrong. But people have always gambled. People have always lost at gambling. Gambling has ruined lives for a long time, I'm sure. But Deb, as per your point, now the people who are designing these sporting bet apps or slot machines, electronic slot machines in particular, we know so much about the brain's dopamine response, about what hooks us. And so these games are designed to keep you playing for longer, to take bigger and bigger risks. So it does seem to me to be a cynical recruitment of our kind of brain chemistry. And if you will, our brain chemistry was designed so that we would reach out into life. That's what dopamine does, right? Dopamine rewards your seeking behavior. So dopamine rewards us for getting out of bed in the morning, essentially. And any kind of smartphone app, and in particular gambling apps and devices, we understand that the dopamine kick and the kind of things that keep the dopamine flowing, such as uncertainty or wins disguised as losses, losses disguised as wins, near misses that just keep you hooked and keep you playing. And so it seems to me that it's actually predatory.
So in addition to the age-old scams, cheating, card sharks who could take advantage of the rubes as if it's a fair game, we now have very intentional and cynical, predatory kinds of systems that are designed to take advantage of people's basic behavioral brain functioning. There's something, a really sinister underbelly.
As we're talking, I'm thinking about dopamine and also the risk to gambling. I'm beginning to shape it as this kind of dance between Eros and Thanatos, because dopamine is part of that love response, whether we fall in love with a person or we're excited because we're gambling or any number of things that give us that rush of euphoria. And I'm taking a bit more of a Freudian stance, but for Freud, there was a kind of dance between Eros and Thanatos, this kind of life and pleasure and death, creation and destruction, and that the tension between that kind of moves our desires forward. So I think it's funny, I just got back from New Orleans. I did a little lecture there, so I've been surrounded by casinos and people frighteningly stumbling drunkenly around the casinos, because that cannot be the smartest way to be throwing money on a table. But this allure of infinite possibilities, the way the machines kind of literally talk, they'll speak to you as you walk by, this seductive beckoning and spinning lights, and this possibility, the erotic possibility that I'm going to win some enormous amount of money or just win anything, and then the lights go off and the beacons sound at your slot machine. So there's all of that kind of truly erotic heat of the gamble. And I think that in that erotic feeling, there's this quality of kind of dissolving into this ecstatic union with the forces of chance. And then this ever-present peril of loss and ruin. And the tension between those two creates a thrilling experience of being alive. I think that's true in many different environments. But as you said, Deb, this is so manipulative and not truly life presenting itself.
Yes. And it's an illusion of being alive, being aroused, being excited, and holding that tension about, am I going to win or lose? And maybe the next pull on the slot machine or roll of the dice or roulette wheel will reward me. That is a sort of a simulation of life. But I would question whether it's really feeling alive. And these environments are designed to waft you out of yourself and out of the everyday world. The lights are always on, the music is on, the drinks are there.
They don't have windows.
No windows. It's 4 a.m, it's 11 a.m, it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You lose all sense of time, which is what it is absolutely designed to do. So it's an ersatz version of life in which arousal substitutes for really being present for yourself. I'm wondering about you talking about Eros, Joseph, and I get it, but what I really think is going on is the legitimization of greed. It is okay in a purely unvarnished way, without any rationale or pretense of one, to just go after the money. I want money. That's what I'm doing, is I want to win money. It's interesting in today's world with all the gambling that's going on is greed has been legitimized, only we just don't call it that. We call it fun. We call it the office football pool. We call it, having a night at XYZ casino. We call it all kinds of other things. I would call it greed.
Well, the one thing I want to push back on, though, is I think that probably problem gamblers are not actually motivated by a search for money. Of course they are, but the other deeper thing going on is something like they're trying to fill a hole. They're trying to maybe compensate for something that they didn't get, or they're simply trying to use gambling as a way to assuage depression, or some research that I read said that they're trying to use it to interrupt sort of continuous negative rumination, so that problem gamblers are often depressed. And, whether or not that's chicken or an egg, there's an argument to be made there either way, I think. Related to this is this finding that, particularly with slot machines, and in particular these new slot machines, people enter a state that researchers have called dark flow. So if you know this psychological idea about flow, that when you're, say, working to learn a piano piece, you can sort of lose track of time and you're in this really wonderful space. And this is kind of the dark side of that, where everything else becomes irrelevant, that you just have kind of tunnel vision for this thing that you're doing, this slot machine in front of you. Dark flow is kind of like a trance state. And personally, I can relate to that. I mean, I've, gotten stuck playing a computer game or being on an app for much longer than I wanted to, because I just got into a little bit of a compulsive track. So I think it's really easy for us all to fall in. So I think we're seeking money, but we're also seeking relief from our suffering. And when I was trying to think of a fairy tale image for that, I thought of, and I know we go back to this one often for pretty much any compulsive behavior, but it's right there. It's the little match girl, that she keeps on burning her matches to bring a momentary relief from suffering, only to be left worse off in the end.
But that's the problem with seeking palliatives. You can have your escapism, like the little match girl lighting one match after another, and you can have your night or days at the casino or any of these other things. And it provides relief for a time, and then you've lost. You've lost time, you've lost money, so you're worse off than you were before. And so you seek another palliative, whatever it is, and it's a vicious cycle. Palliatives, by definition, only provide momentary relief.
Which I think gets back to this idea of the thrill, and which I think is so central. The gambler experiences this thrill of being, quote unquote, truly alive. And I think, as you said, Dad, very wisely, is that really being alive?
Yeah.
And we're also moving in and out of this energy of being addicted to gambling versus just putting your toe in the water, when you're there for a wedding or something like that in Vegas. So I think that when this becomes pathologic and it's not just an occasional zippy little excursion,
sure,
then I think you're right. The sensation seeking becomes a defense against all kinds of problems in the psyche. I think that greed, I was really sitting with that distinction between gambling and greed. Certainly that they could play together, but I generally think of greed in a fairly Freudian standpoint of a kind of retentive, an anal retentive accumulation. That the pleasure in the greed is accumulating and holding and holding and holding on to what we think is the good thing and not letting it go, so it accretes and grows. So that erotic pleasure of retaining, which I think is quite different from the thrill of casting everything out on the table and just seeing if the universe will triple your warnings. And most people I think of that really are greedy, they don't take a lot of risks. Boy, they're gold. They want to keep that in the treasure room very carefully. And whatever they're greedy about, they want to protect it, put a wall around it.
Sort of like Scrooge.
It can get to that point. They don't want fate sucking that stuff out the window just for a thrill.
And yet there is the hope in the reaching, which I think I would put also in the category of greed, that I can reach into it. I can reach for it. That is itself a kind of greed. Of course, your point's well taken. It doesn't really work. Gambling is not a way to really accrete riches and hold on to them. And yet that's the motivation, is to win. And to win what? Well, to win money.
But what often happens is they've done these great studies of people that have won enormous amounts of money in the lotteries, and within a decade, all the money's gone, and they have returned sometimes to worse circumstances because they've wasted 10 years of building a strong platform for the next stage of life. So I think the money comes magically, so it doesn't feel real, and then spending it feels magical, and it doesn't seem to get integrated into the view of oneself as a conservator of one's wealth.
So that takes me to speculating, and you guys can help me on this, speculating about whether the gambling and the desire and the thrill and the reaching is an echo of a very early developmental stage, before there's a real connection between cause and effect, of a sort of impulse control of I see it, I want it, without a lot of cognitive linking functions going on. And especially maybe a very early stage of having consistent caretaking versus inconsistent caretaking. The baby cries or the toddler wants something. Sometimes the caregiver appears, sometimes not. Sometimes right away, sometimes not for a while. So that the person has way down deep this idea that you might as well give it a shot. You might as well give it a try, because this time maybe your lucky number will come up. This time maybe the caregiver will be gratifying. But it's an erratic substrate to the personality rather than something that indicates a more mature cause and effect, ego secure position.
It reminds me of that idea of control and mastery, that the infant is trying to control and master the source of pleasure, the source of the needs being met. And because the infant can't do that, it has to then do all kinds of imaginal accommodations, whether the primary caregiver is internalized as an internal magical figure. Melanie Klein says, the child's hungry and the breast magically appears. The infant has no idea how it arrived or who it's attached to, which is much like this magical winning. I really need to pay the mortgage, so let's take the last bit of the money and go to the casino and see what kind of thrilling thing might happen.
See if Lady Luck provides.
If Lady Luck will do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and the magical breast appears. I mean, that's what I'm talking about with the lack of connection between cause and effect and control, as you mentioned. The baby, we hypothesize, and I think it was Donald Winnicott, but we hypothesize that the baby thinks that when I am hungry and when I cry, that causes the breast or the bottle to appear. And of course, that's fallacious, and yet that is what happens. And I'm hypothesizing that there may be, some of that way deep down, unrecognized, unspoken, when an adult says, we need to pay the mortgage, let's go to the casino. That if I want it, if I need it, if I believe in it, if I cry out for it, that then somehow the slot machine or the roulette table or whatever it is, Lady Luck, will provide.
So, Deb, this sort of an unreliable caregiver, an unreliable connection with your caregiver often will result in the experience of what someone called, I think it was Fairbairn, the exciting object. So it's this sense that there's something or someone that we want, and it's sort of always just out of reach. And so we're in the role of pursuer. It can set up this, if we have that experience in childhood, it can set that up in kind of adult relationships. Yeah. And it's, of course, related to this idea that we've talked about before of relentless hope, that I'm going to keep trying. And interestingly, if you study like behaviorism, you learn, and I think we've touched on this already, but just kind of nailing it down, that one of the strongest reinforcers is an intermittent reinforcement. So if you always get the cheese when the bell rings, it's actually not as strong a reinforcement as if you only sometimes get the cheese when the bell rings. So, and that's because of the effects of dopamine. Dopamine is our brain chemical that says, go out in the world and try, go seek. And if you get something sometimes, it makes you want to seek it more. So that's kind of how we're wired.
What I love that Fairbairn added, it's an exciting object, but it's an exciting withholding object.
Yes.
It's a combination of both. So you walk into the casino and all the lights are spinning and it's all incredibly carnival-like, but it might give you an occasional tiny little win, which seems to promise so much, but actually it withholds the great, wonderful thing. I'm really sitting with this idea of the fantastical realm of it. And I was thinking, Lisa, about the studies you were referring, that when people begin to gamble, they go into, my word would be like a trance state, but I think you had used more clinical language for that. And in that trance state, which as Jungians we would call a liminal state, in that liminal state, the fantasy world becomes much more vibrant. So once we're in that slightly trancey state, and then we have fantasies of the big win, whatever that may be, it really captures the limbic system, it captures the nervous system, and we're really, all wide-eyed and looking for the revelatory kind of moment.
Yeah, and that takes me back to the little match girl, because of course when she would strike her match, she would have these visions of feasts and warm, rich houses, So yeah, I think you're right. I think trance, or what they call dark flow, is really a part of this.
And it also has echoes in very early development. That is what babies do when they've had a good feed, is they're lulled. We're in La La Land. And it's lovely to see an infant in that state. And at the same time, if an infant is overstimulated, the only thing that infant can do to get away from stimulus that it doesn't like is to check out and to, again, go into that kind of trance-like state. It's interesting to consider how we all want to escape sometimes. We want to escape into a good movie at night that's available on our laptop anytime you want it. and how seductive those escapist trance-like states can be. And they do take us out of our adult cognitive minds so that we can zone out. We can tune out the world.
When my kids were young, we read together the Rick Riordan series, Percy Jackson, which is just this wonderful kind of modernization of Greek myths. And so it's basically kind of a retelling of the Odyssey. It's just so brilliant. But when it comes to the part where he's depicting the lotus eaters, the kids all wind up in a casino in Vegas. And it's a great kind of mapping on of this sense of just kind of going completely unconscious and just losing yourself. And, I think in the Odyssey, the lotus eaters, they lose time for years, isn't it?
Yes.
So I thought that was really clever, a little clever mythological allusion there.
And there was a goddess behind all that, Calypso, if I'm remembering rightly. So what I'm thinking about here is who are the modern gods and goddesses who lull people very consciously with very good business plans into their lotus-eating islands of gambling and time out of time trance states. There's a real intent behind this.
So I want to go there for a minute because we know that some people in particular are susceptible to problematic gambling. And I should say, Joseph, you said this earlier and it's worth saying it again. Gambling can be fun. It can be harmless. I've, had friends that, will just designate, here's $500. I'm going to take it and go to Atlantic City and just have fun. And when it's done, it's done. There can be an appropriate place for it. But people who become problematic gamblers it's a terrible, terrible affliction. There is isolation, anxiety, depression, and a significant increase in the risk of suicide. So one estimate says that 19% of problem gamblers attempt suicide, and that is the highest rate of any addiction. That is a very high rate. These sports betting apps that were allowed to come through after the Supreme Court changed their decision in 2018 seem like they're targeted at young men in their 20s. So many of these young men may not have fully developed brains yet. It's tied to something very enticing, which is sports, which, as Deb, as you pointed out, has this social element. And, it seems just sort of very normalized and fun. Sports bettors in particular feel like they're informed and that they have some control because you're betting on teams. It's a little bit like playing the stock market. Like you can convince yourself you know something about it when really it's just all chance. And some of these sports books have marketing deals with large universities. So I'm really concerned that what we're seeing here is the creation of a kind of next epidemic where I'm worried we're going to have lots of young men who wind up in significant debt because they've engaged in, and young women too, but I think it's probably mostly targeted at young men, and that we're going to see problems developing. I have some stats about when states have introduced this. The calls to gambling helplines have shot up astronomically. And I want to just bring back another phenomenon that was a little bit similar. When I went to college in the 80s, we arrived on campus and were immediately offered credit cards with no credit check and often large ceilings. So the thought was, get your credit history started, sign up for this credit card. And so young people were given credit cards, sometimes with debt ceilings as high as $100,000. And many young people went into debt, and there were suicides. And eventually, it was there were lobby groups. Some of the bereaved mothers lobbied the government, and it was seen as a predatory practice. And to me, this looks a lot like it. I mean, maybe I'm sounding an alarm that maybe I'm overreacting, but actually doing this research, it seems like the people who study gambling are very concerned about it. We're luring people into this practice, and compulsive gambling, problem gambling is a severe, crippling problem. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, what that brings up for me is shame. That's always the companion of gambling. That there's
debt,
and which is part of that. So there is a long sinister shadow that gambling casts, and it always, in a sense, is companioned by a dread of the unknown and a fear of these uncontrollable forces. So I think in the gambler's heart, there's a mingling of kind of fear and desire, which creates a kind of cocktail that I think is much more intense and much more consuming. And then as they surrender to these whims of chance, they're constantly just skating barely above the possibility of failure, humiliation, financial annihilation, and all of these kinds of monstrous potentials right underneath them. And out of, I think, that shadowy element of it, people will then want to make the last bet. They have a humiliating failure, and so to redeem themselves will take yet another chance to try to get above the shame of having done something capricious.
I'm just noticing that all three of us have somehow just stopped and sunk into this, aware of how devastating and sad gambling can be, because it can lead to problem gambling and devastation of families and financial stability, and this very, very high suicide rate. I know I'm repeating myself, but behind a lot of it is intentional, predatory, quote, legitimate, or at least legal business practice. And I think that, too, is an incredibly sad commentary on our culture, that if it's legal, you can do it regardless of the consequences it can have for some people.
Yeah, and the New York Times did a kind of investigative piece. Supposedly the states that opened this up were supposed to be getting, a big windfall, and apparently the money has not really been forthcoming. It's mostly lining the pockets of the house, as it were. But Joseph, I'm so glad you brought up shame, because I think that is so devastating.
And I really resonate with it. I mean, like I said, I only lost $3,000, but I feel really embarrassed.
Yeah.
When it went down to a trillionth of a cent. I was like, oh my God, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And I was like dancing around like I did. So it is really, it's humbling if one can take that in. And it's great to get a little bit of a lesson so that, some people put millions of dollars into these gambles. So I think it's much more painful.
But, I'm also wondering about what the other side of this might look like of people that are highly averse to gambling and cannot, stick a toe in the waters of Lady Luck, that there's such a resistance to something that, perhaps might be a recreational engagement with some kind of archetypal energy that is represented by taking a chance. So in the interest of full disclosure here, I'm one of those. I was once taken to a racetrack, and I was a teenager, and I was given $20 to spend, and I thought that was really a lot of money, and I could do whatever I wanted. And I made 2 or 3 $2 bets, and then I stopped. And was I really being sensible and so on? Well, sure, the house always wins, and God knows I didn't know what I was doing. But also I was seized by tremendous anxiety. It was coming from a defensive place that I couldn't enjoy some of the thrill, some of the excitement, the cheering for whichever horse I'd bet on.
You couldn't surrender to the experience.
Right, I could not. So it's loaded on the other side with a kind of fear and a tremendous amount of distrust that this is not fun in any way, shape, or form. And I'm imagining that a healthier attitude might look like it's okay to play.
Yeah.
Well, I think that there is an upside to risk tolerance. I mean, that's part of every heroic journey, although I don't think it's the same thing as gambling, but I understand how it's leaning against it a little bit. That going off to college is a bit of a gamble, or at least we put the gambling lens on it. And particularly right now when kids are really trapped in this conversation about the cost-benefit analysis of going to school. It'll cost me thus and such to get a degree in English, but my earning potential will be this or that. So it feels much more dice throwing, I think, even right now than perhaps it did other times. But there is a kind of audacity that's required to take a gamble on oneself, which is really different than taking a gamble on the goddess Fortuna or on the casino. Because at least if you're taking a gamble on yourself, you have some control over some of the elements on how it turns out.
That's a good point.
And where is the gamble? Aside from the cost-benefit analysis, quote unquote, if there really is one, about something like getting a college degree, which is so outrageously expensive, or the cost-benefit analysis of majoring in art history or English or heaven forfend philosophy versus engineering, let's say, one of the STEM things. Of the risk is, how do I grow myself? What am I really interested in, curious about? And what I have will be in me, having read all those novels or learned to appreciate all that art or been steeped in philosophical life outlooks and views. It's not really a risk because you've got what you've got and nobody can ever take that away from you. What you have educated yourself to appreciate and know stays with you, although it may not be well remunerated in the external world. But again, we're back to the money. Is it about the money? And that doing well in this world means, what will get me the biggest paycheck.
I mean, that is one frame of it, that money is such an exciting idea. It's so potentializing to the psyche that one can get a little bit lost in all of that. But again, I have to say that the thrill of gambling, I think, can land on anything. And the rare times I've worked with somebody who had a gambling problem, which really doesn't come into my office very much at all.
It doesn't come in mine either.
There was a feeling that they would bet on anything. Football games, horse races, anything they could get their hands on to have that feeling of excitement and potential. And I think we all know that in a small degree. Like every couple of months, I'll just buy a lottery ticket. The ticket gets up to whatever incredible amount of money. I really know I'm not going to win it. But when I buy it, I'm able to indulge a certain kind of elated fantasy. That this little imaginal door of possibility opens. And then I wind up asking myself, well, what would I do with $50 million? What would be potentiated? And so really it's like I've bought a theater ticket. although it's a lottery ticket.
You bought a fantasy.
Yes.
I bought a fantasy for a couple of days.
Yeah.
A part of me doesn't even want to check the numbers because I know I didn't win, and it's much more fun to sit in the feeling of the what if. So much more
so there's
fun.
there's something too here, I think, about puer psychology, I suspect. I think that probably many gamblers are puers. That's Jung's term comes from the Latin word for boy, that sort of Peter Pan kind of quality. That you're living in the realm of eternal possibility rather than just sort of getting down to reality.
I'm interested in what you just said, Joseph, about how you bought yourself a fantasy, and that there is a doorway here into possibility of, what would I do if I won $50 million? And sometimes some of the jackpots, I think, are even bigger than that in the lotteries. Of what would I do? That I can see could open one up into a kind of expanded self of things that I would love to be able to do, that I would love to be able to benefit people in my family and my friend group, my very favorite charities, that I can see can very much be real world possibilities at a much smaller level, but it extends us into those kinds of fantasy possibilities that could have real traction in our everyday life.
And I find that sometimes, and we've spoken about this before on the podcast, but the ability to imagine expansively is actually very important. So when I have someone who's unhappy with his or her life, one of the things I'll do is, sort of, what would you do sort of if you won the lottery? What would you do if the sky were the limit? And sometimes people cannot come up with anything, and that's not a good sign. So to be able to have that fantasy is really to be able to allow that kind of inflation and have a place in your life is really important. I want to go back to something you said, Joseph, about how it doesn't come into your practice very much. I've thought about that, and I suspect it's because by the time you're a problem gambler, you don't have the money for psychological treatment. So there are problem gambling programs, but you can't. The person doesn't have money, so they must be kind of publicly funded programs.
But there is also Gamblers Anonymous, and that the 12-step programs are substantive, worthwhile, time-tested, and they do not cost any money.
Right.
And I have not had problem gamblers in my practice, but I have had people who are in recovery from alcohol or other substance abuses. And the 12-step programs are, in my view, fundamental and foundational to recovery support. They're absolutely invaluable and available.
And it's worth pointing out while we're here that, is gambling actually an addiction? I suppose that depends, how you define it. But I think most people say absolutely yes, that it's got the dopamine thing that you get from smoking or from, taking a substance. And so it is physiologically addictive. In fact, it has a kind of a more powerful dopaminergic effect than some other things. And in fact, it's a little different than being addicted to a substance, because if you're using heroin or you're using alcohol, your partner, your wife, your family is going to know that. It's very obvious. But you can be, grilling a steak and, betting away the house on your phone at the same time. I mean, so some people call it the hidden addiction.
I think that we all need to be sober about these archetypal forces, which goes to Jung's great effort to educate all of us on these ancient, powerful patterns that can take hold of the human ego, shape how we perceive the environment, give us certain thoughts or feelings, and we have to pay a kind of price because we've lost touch with many other aspects of our humanity, including our vulnerability, not the least of, and how compelling all of this can be. I wanted to spend just a little bit more time on the goddess Fortuna, because she really played a big part in Greco-Roman world. She returns to us in the Renaissance, and her iconography moves all over the place. It's really a substantial image. And even from early on, people recognized the capriciousness of fortune. They had different names for her. She was Fortuna bona, good fortune, and Fortuna mala, bad, evil fortune. So this holding of the tension of the opposites, of pleasure and suffering, has been something that human beings have tried to make sense of since the beginning, and particularly in terms of events that we don't seem to have any control over, that impose themselves on us. And in the Renaissance, the Wheel of Fortune was a very favorite symbol. In Tarot, there's a Wheel of Fortune, the 10th tarot card.
And the TV show.
And the TV show, Wheel of Fortune, right? There's something about this spinning wheel of time and fate, and the rise of fortune and fall of fortune. This is something that's consumes our imaginations, and it did for the ancient Greeks and Romans, trying to understand or get some kind of a theory about the rise and fall of our fortunes. Sometimes we're in a good place, sometimes we're not. And how do we understand and relate to what seems to control our destiny? And in that regard, I think Jung has some interesting things to say, because he famously is quoted, "What we do not become conscious of in ourselves, we then experience as fate." So there are powerful forces that are at work in our own unconscious minds that push us toward or away from all kinds of circumstances. And when these forces are primarily unconscious, they can be costly to us, and they feel like malevolent gods, but they are actually forces in our own psyche. And if we press a little bit more into Jung's idea around this unified field and synchronicity, these unconscious forces seem to be able to tickle the events around us, to even pull towards us positive or negative experiences. And we're mystified. Why did I get fired again? How did that happen? Another neighbor is starting a war with me. Or once again, my paycheck fell out of my wallet and I don't know where it is. Where are the car keys? I lost my iPhone in the airport. All of these turns of fortune, which many of us can relate to, are actually decisive events that are rising up out of the unconscious mind. Something is trying to talk to us, and sometimes the language is a conversation around suffering and misfortune. So Fortuna Mala may actually reside in us.
I want to leave us maybe with a very quick fairy tale image that has to do with gambling. So there's a fairy tale called The Dream of Marking the Treasure, where a gambler lights a candle to the devil, and that night he dreams that the devil takes him to a place where a treasure is buried. The devil tells him to mark the place with his excrement, and so the gambler does. But when he wakes up in the morning, he just finds that he has shat the bed. That was a conversation stopper.
That's what you're leaving us with?
To pick up.
Well, I think it's something about the illusion, the illusory nature of what we hope to get when we gamble.
What I'm thinking about is, what happens in Vegas is real life.
Yeah.
That's what happens. The house always wins. And the real life is when you leave Vegas after having, in all great likelihood, lost.
Yeah. Hopefully had fun too. But, well, before we move to a dream, I just want to remind listeners about Dream School. Dream School is a program that the three of us put together. We custom built it for our listeners to teach you how to work with your own dreams from a Jungian lens. So if you like what we do, when we interpret dreams on the podcast, we walk you through how to do that. And it's a self-paced 12-month program. And you can find out more about it by going to our website, thisjungianlife.com, and you'll see a button for Dream School. So we hope you'll check it out.
So now let's move on to a dream. And this week's dreamer is a woman. She's 39 years old and a counselor. And here's her dream. I was sitting in the kitchen of my paternal grandmother's house. I was planning to steal money from her. I was with a female acquaintance who was helping me plan this, and there was a sense of urgency as we needed to get things sorted before my grandmother got home. I was looking out the kitchen window, and it was a fairly gray day outside. All of a sudden, there was a loud explosion, and there was a fire somewhere in the house. A huge sense of fear and panic occurred, and so myself and the female acquaintance ran outside via the front of the house, and we made it out safely. To my surprise, my grandmother also came out the front door. She looked more overweight than I remembered her, and her hair was more gray and unkempt. She looked disgusting, and her skin in particular was blotchy, scarred, and she had patches of skin that had holes in it. I did not feel any concern for her well-being, only disgust when I saw the state of her skin. And for context, the dreamer adds, I've been having difficult feelings toward a female friend of mine for some time, and have been contemplating if I actually want to remain friends with her. Recently, she did something that really irritated me. It irritated several of my other friends as well, and we spoke about this with one another. It brought up a lot of judgment toward her, that she can be very selfish. I communicated to her that I wanted to have a chat with her to be open about some of these difficult feelings I was having regarding the recent situation that triggered me. I'm also in a stuck place in my relationship with my partner regarding our physical intimacy, which has waned, and we both appear stuck as to how to overcome it. This issue can trigger feeling unloved and undesired. The main feelings in the dream were fear, panic, and disgust. And for additional context, the dreamer says, I cut contact with my paternal grandmother many years ago after a series of hurtful things she did. I also have no contact with my father, who cut me and my siblings off a few years ago. My father left our family when I was 4 years old after having an extramarital affair, and our relationship has always been distant. My grandmother can be nasty, even cruel, and I never felt comfortable when I was at her house when I was a child. She dresses and presents herself immaculately, but her facial figures have a witchy look to me. The female acquaintance is not someone I know well, but she is known to me through my closest female friend, who I cherish. She has 2 young children. I have 1 young child. She strikes me as a very kind and gentle mother and person, and she's a very spiritual person. I have some judgments about her as a bit airy-fairy. Regarding fire, I was accidentally burned by my father when we were having a family barbecue at home when I was about 2 years old.
Well, Deb, I will take a page from your book and note that it starts off in the kitchen of the paternal grandmother's house. So we're in the field of this kind of witchy paternal grandmother, and we're in the kitchen, which is sort of the heart of the home, the place where alchemical transformations take place. It's often where people gather. It's where we are often fed, or at least where food is prepared. So it's where we're nourished. And so there's something very important here about this paternal grandmother. And I'll maybe just tip my hand and say that I wonder if this paternal grandmother is a shadow figure, a kind of counterbalance to the very sweet, nice, airy-fairy female companion, and maybe an outpicturing of the dreamer's own capacity for selfishness and cruelty that she needs to become better friends with.
I'm also thinking about the kitchen as the place where, that in ancient times was the place that was warm in the house. It's the place of fire. It's a place where even animals were sheltered against the cold. And of course, there's the cooking of the food. And it's the place of fire. And fire can burn as well as warm and heat. And there is that element in the dream as well.
I find myself thinking about the grandmother being the father's mother. It's the paternal grandmother, and the relationship with the father in her imagination is fraught. So if I think about this as an outpicturing of the father's mother complex, and how might the father's mother complex have influenced his relationship to being a dad, his relationship to his own children and his wife. And I'm wondering if the unconscious is ready to have you consider the family suffering in a more psychological way and in a less judgmental way. So from an ego standpoint, people do things that cause us pain, put us in difficult circumstances. Of course that happens, even traumatic experiences. And when we've processed it on an ego level, the unconscious does want to talk about this in a more psychological and universal frame, which holds the possibility that we can depersonalize the events in our lives. So if I imagine this dreamer's dad being raised by a mom who is cruel, who is not attentive to physical dynamics for herself or for her children, is not well related, or doesn't know how to relate to children, then I'm imagining you've got a dad with an attachment disorder. You've got a dad who's very ambivalent about attachment. That's really interesting because the dreamer has inherited this unfortunate capacity to cut off and dispose of people who displease her. And I think we're looking at, in that Bowen genogram way, a multi-generational attachment wound, which we would call ambivalent attachment. That when somebody comes and we connect to them, we don't know if we're going to get good stuff or painful stuff. And so the infant is really ambivalent about trusting, ambivalent about receiving very much, can't trust what it's going to receive, and that can become a life pattern. So when there's discomfort later in life, we can find ourselves having no tolerance for rough periods in our relationships, that it's just done and over, can't put up with it, because we don't have the resilience of a firm attachment where stress can happen and then people come back and repair things and good things flow again that have been interrupted. So this process of cutting off, this ambivalence about attachment, the ease with which people can be cut off, I think is being attributed back in time to the father's mother complex, and considering that again may free up the dreamer to be less personal, to let go of the idea that all these factors were out to get her, and that we are all caught in these webs of all kinds of forces that are very difficult for all of us to navigate. And that might be freeing.
There were a couple things that I noted. There's some polarities here. So first of all, it's a grade A, and it's a grade A outside, but there's a fire inside. Mm-hmm. There is, the actual grandmother was kind of immaculate in her presentation, but the grandmother in the dream is, she's unkempt and she looks disgusting and she's got this scarred skin. So there's something about appearances not matching, or there's some kind of polarities. And then, of course, there's this very interesting thing that she's planning on stealing from her grandmother, which to me, I think, Joseph, what you lifted up really makes a lot of sense. And I'm still back at she needs to take something from this grandmother. There's something she needs to take from her. So stealing often in dreams has a kind of positive valence to it, because it shows that we're reaching for something that maybe has been difficult for us to claim before. And so what is it she needs to steal from the grandmother? Is it her capacity for selfishness and aggression?
I was thinking about that too, of the element of transgression. And that in dreams and in fairy tales, it's always a question of, is the transgression, going to be in the service of growth and development and getting the treasure, whatever the treasure is in a fairy tale, or is it going to result in some kind of punishment? So I was interested in the transgressive stuff of, I'm going to take something from her that might activate her own capacity for aggression and getting what she needs. And she is aligned with the female acquaintance who's going to help her. So she has a co-conspirator here. She has help. And the female acquaintance is echoed, her real life association, to a closest female friend who I cherish, who seems to be a loving, kind, and gentle mother and spiritual, but wondering about her as a little bit maybe sort of airy-fairy. So I'm thinking that there is some positive female, feminine alliance energy in the dream that is echoed by her being such close friends with a good person in the external world, with some doubts about whether this kind, gentle attitude is really grounded or not. And in the real world also, she is working on relationships. The person that she was irritated by, she reached out to say, hey, can we talk about this? And in her partner, where there's been a lack of physical intimacy, she wants to work on that too. She's not sure how to overcome it, but it's in consciousness. So I've been kind of hypothesizing that this negative mother complex, as you articulated, Joseph, through the father, is really being worked on in the dream and in waking life.
I find the sequence really interesting. In the house, plan to steal, explosion, grandmother is invisible, feelings of disgust. So there is some sense, I think as both of you are suggesting, there is a treasure in the grandmother. Mm-hmm. There's something valuable that archetype may have. And again, if we can separate out the complex from the archetype, the grandmother, the great mother, has treasures. She has treasures for all of humanity. When it's coated in the negative emotional experiences we have with our physical grandparents or mothers, then it becomes a complex that shrouds often the positive potential that's inside of the archetype. So as you were saying, Deb, with the beginning of awareness, even plotting to steal means value is beginning to be perceived. There is a treasure somewhere in the middle of these memories and these insights that you're working on about relational dynamics. What I would say is that as you're going into this work, trying to find the gold in the shit, which is that alchemical stuff, you're going to or have encountered something explosive. And the emotional effect of the explosion, which is surprising, unexpected, disturbing, is that there's panic and fear. Mm-hmm. And often when we are delving into the unconscious and we're begin to put our hands on stuff in our own shadow or stuff we didn't realize, the ego gets pretty anxious by the amount of energy and intensity that we find. And an explosion is a lot of energy that's suddenly been released. And the ego doesn't know what to do with that. And so she just kind of runs out the door.
And just a little archetypal amplification that you made me think of, Joseph. I love what you did there with explosive. But as for there being a treasure in the grandmother, in Hansel and Gretel, just like this grandmother who looked really good, but was actually a witch. And Hansel and Gretel, they come to this, magical cottage that is made of candy, basically. So it looks really good. But inside there's a witch. But when they can defeat the witch, what they discover inside the house is a treasure. So that's a very common fairy tale theme.
So often the complex keeps us away from certain potentials in ourselves. If we have very negative feelings of the Great Mother, we don't want to be mothering. We don't want to be mothered. We don't want to mother ourselves. And sometimes we need that very much. We don't want to mother the relationships we're in, which might require careful tending because our associations with that energy are so negative. So when we can find the positive valence of it, all of a sudden, all kinds of good stuff could happen, and it could even be shocking.
Mm.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.